My preliminary task focused on camera techniques and rules in which we had to demonstrate, such as the 180-degree rule, match on action and shot reverse shot. These were all new techniques I had learned to create a short video to demonstrate all these techniques. This ultimately prepared me for the finished product, which became my opening sequence, in which I demonstrated each of these techniques again. This developed my understanding of industry practice and developed knowledge of professional practice. For script writing, I learned that the script does not simply include the dialogue of the actors, it also includes the camera angles, audio, stage direction and the setting of the scene. This is so that the director can have a sense of understanding of how the scene should look whilst filming. The shot list and shooting schedule are also used for the understanding of the setting of the scene, as it includes the day of the filming, the costumes required, actors required and finally the props required. All of these factors allow me to be organised and confident about my filming. I also found picking the characters' appearances difficult. For example, their costumes. It was hard for me to portray the look of both criminals and a teenager. I overcame this by researching how existing films have portrayed criminals. For example, The Godfather depicted criminals as smartly dressed, therefore I had a character wear a black shirt and black work pants. However, being a teenager myself, I knew the stereotypical clothing they would wear, therefore no research was required. The animatic sequence of the opening sequence is to create an understanding of how the shot is going to look in terms of camera angles, how the actor will walk, where they will walk from, how they will use the prop and their general movement in the film. This will benefit me as it was clearer to see my idea of how I wanted my opening sequence to look on paper, and then later put together in a series of clips to manipulate what my finished product will look like. These show my intentions of the final product. One of the aspects of media research was the codes and conventions of my chosen genre, thriller. For example, I learned that the instrumental intense music builds up a sense of suspense amongst the audience. Therefore, I used instrumental slow-moving music in my opening sequence. Furthermore, I also learned that low-key lighting creates the same effect of suspense amongst the audience. Therefore, the shots in my opening sequence are dark and low-key. The codes and conventions are important to capture within my sequence for my target audience to easily distinguish that my project is a thriller film aimed at them. For my research into titles and timings, I found that for thriller films, existing thriller titles use black and white fonts to make a bold title that people will. This was also achieved by all capital letters, so that the viewer will feel the title is important and therefore read it. Because of this, I made my opening sequence a white font on a black background to stand out in the centre of the frame. It was important for me to research existing titles and timings to make my opening sequence appear as more professional as possible. Therefore, taking in aspects of other successful titles would benefit my sequence. For example, I learned that titles appear for an average of 3 seconds for most films, unless the film is a children's movie, which appears for 4 seconds. This is so that the titles are read, but do not distract the viewer from the scene. This is also done by positioning the titles around the edge of the frame, except for the film title, which is placed directly in the centre of the frame for maximum impact. In terms of age rating, we research what aspects of the content of films set what age ratings. For example, Monsters Inc. is rated a U because it contains mild fantasy threat and one use of mild language. Therefore, it's generally acceptable for children. Furthermore, Reservoir Dogs is rated an 18 due to its extreme use of graphic violence, gore, and very strong language. After researching and considering these aspects, I came to the conclusion that my film is a 15 due to the fact that there is inconsistent strong language and mild threat. This made me understand that I need to control certain aspects of my film to control the age rating itself. For example, if I had had a character threaten another with the prop of a gun, this would class as a violent threat, which would most likely lead to an 18 rating from the BBFC's classification system. During the 3 reviews task, I learned what professional filmmakers use to create their films. For example, they use sharp fonts for a horror film, or fast-paced music for an action movie. Because of this, I took these aspects of specifically the thriller genre and applied them to my own. For example, I learned that music that builds up over time creates a tense atmosphere, and that titles for a thriller film are simple and are positioned around the edge of the frame, away from the centre, apart from the main title, which is placed directly in the centre. Finally, I used audience research via a self-made online questionnaire in which I shared on social media sites such as Facebook and Instagram. Therefore, I tried to make characters the most relatable part of my opening sequence. I used all of the camera angles I learned in my preliminary tasks in my final sequence, as well as things like the 180-degree rule. For example, I learned how to use match on action, which I demonstrated at the very start of my sequence, when one of the characters first walked into the abandoned house, which is shown from 2 different perspectives. This was an editing technique I wasn't aware of before the preliminary task. I also learned to use a mid-shot when focusing on the characters rather than the location. I use this in my opening sequence so that the audience can focus on the character's dialogue more than anything else. I also use audio correctly and experimentally. For example, I had to turn up the audio in certain clips as they were shot on a quieter microphone. I also overlapped two of the clips' audio so it appears two characters are talking over one another, which ultimately created a sense of realism, as in reality people do have the tendency to talk over each other. I also use an MP3 music file to overlap some clips to set a certain mood of suspense for the audience to feel. This was also achieved by using the same technique with silence. I have also become more skilled at editing. For example, the match on action featured in my final opening sequence runs a much smoother transition than that of my preliminary task. To further demonstrate my improvement of editing skills, my use of framing has also improved. However, the lack of framing shows us off-center, which looks unprofessional. This is unlike my final sequence, as I have considered framing carefully by positioning the actor/actors in the centre of the frame, or in some cases in wide shots, all on the frame, so all the actors are visible at one time. My use of mise-en-scene has also improved by considering the costumes and the characters and what they would be wearing, as well as consideration to props. For example, I use costumes that are stereotypical to teenagers, like expensive clothing brands such as Superdry and Vans. I also use the prop of a cracked iPhone 6 to represent teenagers have expensive phones, but yet are irresponsible. I also learned how to manage my time using the shooting schedule, which also led me to better organise the people involved, as I knew what they would be wearing and which actors are needed for which shot. My hardware skills have improved as I have learned better how to use the camera, as I know the positioning of the camera is important to avoid the clips being overexposed. I also now know how to better display my titles more appropriately. For example, I now know that all my titles appear for 3 seconds at the side of the frame, unless it's the film title, which in this case is placed in the centre of the frame.